Haicheng, Liaoning Province, China, a small industrial town in the northern part of the Liaodong Peninsula. Life here doesn't move at the breakneck pace of major cities. After COVID-19, people had only one way to survive month to month: saving money. Save what you can. Compare prices when you can. And so, the entire town's shopping habits funneled into one tiny hub, a package pickup station in front of an apartment complex. The shop was nothing special. An ordinary sign, a small storefront, the first floor filled with counters and shelving, the second floor just a cramped room with barely enough space for a bed. But for the residents nearby, it was the nerve center of daily life. Stopping by to grab packages before work, swinging through again after, picking up online orders on the way home from school drop-off. Every single day. So routine that if the rolling shutter opened even a few minutes late, people noticed something was wrong. Early morning, July 11th, 2023. Dawn had just broken, and the street in front of the apartment complex was starting to see foot traffic. A few regulars stopped in front of the station, glancing up at the metal shutter out of habit, waiting for the familiar rattling sound as it rolled up. But that day, silence. The door didn't open. No footsteps, no rustling of packages, no phone notifications. Just an eerie emptiness stretching minute after minute. At first, they figured the owner had simply overslept, or maybe something came up at home. They'd wait a bit longer, then leave. But as time passed, more familiar faces gathered, because this station had always opened right on time, especially in the mornings when people needed to grab their packages before rushing to work. And it was from that moment, when the shutter refused to rise, that a tragedy began to reveal itself, quietly, but with enough force to shake the entire small town to its core. The regulars at this delivery station all knew it was run by two sisters from the same family, sharing responsibility for the business. The younger sister was named Du Yue, around 37 years old. She was the one who managed the station day to day and lived on the second floor, a small room partitioned off from the storage space, just big enough for a bed and basic necessities. Living with her were her mother, a woman in her early 60s, and her young daughter Bei Bei, who had just turned 13. It was summer break, so the girl spent most of her time at home with her mother and grandmother. Sometimes you could see Bei Bei tucked into a corner of the first floor, doing homework among the towering stacks of packages, occasionally getting up to help her mom hand off small parcels to customers. The older sister was named Du Jin. Unlike her younger sister, she didn't live at the station. She had her own home elsewhere, reportedly a villa in a nicer part of town. Still, every morning, Du Jin would show up right on time to open for business. That morning, Du Jin arrived at the station as usual. She parked, got out, and walked toward the familiar rolling shutter. But from her very first glance, an uneasy feeling crept over her. What struck her as strange was the silence. An abnormal, unsettling silence. You have to understand, a package station is never truly quiet. As long as someone's inside, even just one person, there's always sound. The ping of a phone notification for a new order, footsteps moving between shelves, the rustle of plastic bags as someone searches for a package, mother and daughter calling out to each other. But that morning, all those familiar sounds had vanished. Only an eerie stillness remained. Du Jin pulled out her key, unlocked the door, and stepped inside the first floor. It was still dark, with only a faint streak of morning light slipping through the gap in the door. Out of habit, she called out her sister's name. Her voice echoed through the space, but no one answered. She called again, louder this time, hoping her sister was just sleeping deeply upstairs. Still nothing. A growing sense of dread began to rise in Du Jin's chest. She stopped at the foot of the stairs, standing there for a few seconds, trying to steady herself. Maybe they're all just sound asleep, but her feet wouldn't stay still. She started climbing the stairs, one step at a time, each step faster than the last, as if some invisible force was urging her to hurry, hurry. When she reached the top, she noticed the door to the second-floor room wasn't fully closed. It was cracked open slightly. Du Jin reached out and pushed it gently, and in the very next instant, Her scream shattered the morning silence. Du-jin spun around and bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping on the last few steps. She burst through the first floor, slammed into the front door, and kept running across the street, screaming the entire time. Neighbors heard the commotion and rushed out. They found Du-jin standing there, face pale as paper, her whole body trembling, unable to speak a word. Moments later, someone pulled out a phone and dialed the police. Less than 10 minutes after the emergency call, the wail of police sirens echoed from the end of the alley. Yellow crime scene tape went up immediately, blocking the entrance. The surrounding area was quickly cordoned off. The criminal investigation team arrived shortly after. Clad in protective suits, wearing rubber gloves, carrying specialized equipment cases and cameras to document the scene, they made their way up the stairs to the second floor one by one. When the door swung fully open, even these seasoned investigators had to pause, holding their breath for a moment. 3 women lay inside, no signs of life. The room was small to begin with, barely enough space for a large bed, a small bed, and a few basic necessities. The living area and storage area overlapped, cramped into a suffocating tightness. The only space left to move was the narrow gaps between objects. In such a confined area, any struggle would leave obvious traces. And indeed, as the investigators began documenting the scene, they quickly confirmed one thing. This was not the aftermath of a quick surgical attack. Furniture had been knocked over and scattered. There had been resistance. There had been direct confrontation between the killer and the victims in that room. Based on the preliminary examination of the bodies and the state of the scene, the investigation team estimated the time of death, sometime between 2 and 3 a.m. In that cramped space with no escape, a violent struggle had taken place. Outside the crime scene tape, police kept urging the crowd to step back, but the gathering only grew larger. People pulled others over, everyone wanting to know what had happened. I heard the kid was only a teenager. The whole family, all 3 of them. Just those few words were enough to send chills down anyone's spine. But the more people heard, the less it made sense. This family had no enemies, living right above their shop, doors locked tight at night. Who could have gotten in at that hour? Who could be cold-blooded enough to harm all 3, including a child? The more you thought about it, the more disturbing it became. This case was starting to reveal something more terrifying than death itself: calculation. For police, the scariest thing about working a case isn't a chaotic crime scene or gruesome remains. The scariest thing is having no leads, investigating endlessly only to hit dead ends. But this case was different. Just hours after the bodies were discovered, police found their first thread. The station's first floor had a security camera. Nothing unusual. Most stations have one to keep an eye on merchandise and deter theft. With goods piled high and people constantly coming and going, a camera was standard practice. As soon as they took over the case, the task force immediately extracted all the video footage. They didn't bother watching what happened after sunrise. Instead, they rewound the timeline, scrolling back from early morning on July 11th to the night before, stopping at the 2 to 3 a.m. window. In the footage, the street was dark, with only a few streetlights casting dim pools of light. Around 2 a.m. on July 11th, a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. A tall man. He walked without hurry, his gait steady and confident, showing no signs of sneaking or caution. The way he moved made it clear this wasn't his first time here. He knew every step of the way. He walked straight toward the delivery station and went inside. The entire process was captured clearly, not a second missed. Police extracted the footage and printed out the clearest shot of the man's face, then brought it to Du-jin, the older sister of victim Du-yue. Du-jin took the photo and stared at it for a few seconds. Her expression changed completely. Without hesitation, without a moment's thought, she spoke a name: Li En-sheng. Her voice was iron certain, because the man in the photo was no stranger. He was Du-yue's husband. The moment they had a name, police immediately began verifying his identity. Li En-sheng, male, born in 1984, native of Haicheng, approximately 5 feet 10 inches, with a stocky, muscular build. Every detail matched the figure in the surveillance footage. The suspect was confirmed. Now the arrest became a race against time. That same afternoon and into the next day, the Haicheng Police Department issued a wanted notice with a reward. Anyone providing information leading to Li Ensheng's capture would receive 50,000 yuan, approximately $7,000. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, the suspect's photo and information appeared on thousands of phones across the city. From tea houses to markets, the case was all anyone could talk about. But the task force wasn't sitting around waiting for tips from the public. They were working every angle. Checkpoints were set up at key transportation hubs. Meanwhile, they traced Li Ensheng's movements. Had he left the area? Had he visited any relatives? Were there any unusual transactions in his accounts? Had he bought any bus or train tickets or booked any hotels? One detail caught investigators' attention during the probe. After the crime, a key to the delivery station was missing. Police suspected Li Ensheng may have used this key to enter the premises without having to break in or make any noise. But what surprised everyone was what happened 2 days later. On July 13th, police received a call reporting that Li Ensheng was at home, not his city residence, his parents' house in the countryside. Officers were immediately dispatched. But when they arrived, the scene wasn't what you'd expect when apprehending a murder suspect. Li Ensheng didn't run. He didn't resist. He was already dressed neatly, his personal belongings packed and ready beside him, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. When police walked in, he stood up and went with them with an eerie calm. The one who couldn't stay calm was his mother. She rushed forward and clung to her son, refusing to let go, tears streaming down her face, repeating over and over, "Just one more hug. Let me hold you one more time." Li Ensheng remained strangely composed. He kept emphasizing to the police that this was a surrender, not an arrest. And that phone call just now? He had told his family to make it. The reason. He wanted them to receive the 50,000 yuan reward money. For police, capturing a suspect is only the beginning. What comes next is more important. Interrogation, evidence collection, and reconstructing the entire sequence of events. Because the real answers aren't found at the arrest site. They lie in what happened before and why. Through the investigation, a picture of Li Ensheng's life began to take shape. It turned out both Li Ensheng and Du Yue had been married before. This was a second marriage for both of them. When police interviewed relatives and neighbors, nearly everyone described Li Ensheng the same way. Quiet, hardworking, honest, never caused trouble with anyone. Li Ensheng was born and raised in the countryside, in a family that wasn't well off. By around 16, he had dropped out of school and left home to find work. At first, he did day labor at construction sites, any backbreaking job, as long as it brought in money. Eventually, he picked up electrical and plumbing skills and followed work crews from project to project. His parents back home were in poor health and couldn't do heavy labor, so for years Li Ensheng was essentially the sole breadwinner for the entire family. The villagers' assessment of him was consistent, not a smooth talker, but hard-working, and when times got tough, he'd grit his teeth and bear it alone. His first marriage lasted a few years before falling apart. According to relatives, the reason wasn't complicated. He was away working year-round, the couple rarely saw each other, and the feelings just faded over time. In the end, they parted amicably, with no children and no disputes over property. After the divorce, Li Ensheng stayed single for a long time. As he got older and showed no signs of remarrying, his family grew anxious. In rural areas, a man approaching 40 who still hasn't found a new wife carries no small burden. The pressure came not only from village gossip, but from his parents' very real fears, that if he stayed alone too long, his life would just drift apart. In early 2022, through a matchmaker's introduction, Li Ensheng met Du Yue. Du Yue was also from Haicheng, about 2 years younger than him, divorced with a daughter named Bei Bei. After their first meeting, Ensheng came away with a good impression. Du Yue spoke softly, carried herself gracefully, and seemed like someone who knew how to manage a household. Bei, though meeting a stranger, didn't fuss or cause trouble. For a man pushing 40 who longed for a family, this seemed like a promising start. About 3 months after meeting, the two began discussing marriage. Everything moved quickly, seemingly smoothly, but looking back, this was exactly when the story began its slide into the abyss. According to Li Ensheng's testimony during interrogation, as well as information police gathered from relatives on both sides, this marriage was bound to money from the very beginning. Du Yue demanded a bride price of 188,000 yuan, approximately 26,000 US dollars. This was no small sum, especially for a rural family like Li Ensheng's. He had no way to come up with that much from savings. In the end, he scraped together everything he had saved from years of manual labor, over 80,000 yuan, and then borrowed another 100,000 from relatives. Pooling every last resource, he finally gathered enough to meet the bride price demand. After the bride price changed hands, you'd think the biggest expense was behind him. But no. The bills kept coming, one after another. Not long after the wedding, Du Yue brought up changing homes. Her reasoning sounded reasonable enough. The current place was old and cramped. Her mother would be moving in to live with them, and Bei was growing up and needed her own room. At the time, Li Ensheng owned a small 2-bedroom apartment, a place he'd bought years earlier with his savings. It was old but fully paid off with no mortgage. It was the only asset in his name. Du Yue suggested selling that apartment to buy a bigger 3-bedroom place. Li Ensheng agreed. He listed the house and sold it for over 300,000 yuan, approximately 42,000 US dollars. But when they went house hunting, Du Yue set her sights on a 3-bedroom unit priced around 600,000 yuan, approximately 84,000 US dollars. The gap was nearly 300,000 yuan, double what they'd just gotten from selling his apartment. Du Yue told him to take out a bank loan to cover the rest. With no other option, Li Ensheng dipped into his meager remaining savings and took on new debt just to make the down payment and complete the purchase. But the real-time bomb planted in this marriage came down to one detail that seemed like mere paperwork: whose name would go on the property deed. When signing the purchase contract, Du Yue proposed putting her mother's name, Wang Shulan, as the owner. Her reasoning sounded smooth enough. The old woman would feel more secure seeing her name on the deed, and it would make living together more stable. Li Ensheng hesitated. He was putting up most of the money, yet the house wouldn't be in his name. Still, after some deliberation, he agreed. His thinking was simple. They were husband and wife now, which meant they were one family. Living together, working through things together. He didn't want to start fights over whose name was on a piece of paper. With the house purchased, you'd think he could finally breathe. But no, renovations became the next hurdle. Du Yue said she'd handle the decorating and design. He just needed to provide the money. And so he dug into his pockets again, this time handing over 70,000 yuan, approximately 10,000 US dollars. According to him later, that was essentially the last of the savings he could scrape together. After that, Li Ensheng packed up and went back to working jobs far from home. He had no choice. The monthly mortgage had to be paid. The bride price debt owed to relatives wasn't yet cleared. Daily household expenses still needed covering. It all fell on his shoulders. Money had become an invisible chain, tightening a little more each day, dragging him deeper into a spiral with no way out. From then on, Li Ensheng entered a work routine that bordered on self-punishment. By day, he worked as an electrician and plumber on construction sites. By night, instead of resting, he took overnight warehouse shifts to earn extra. Day bleeding into night, night bleeding into day. He barely had a moment to catch his breath. Working himself to the bone like that, he could bring in over 10,000 yuan, approximately 1,400 US dollars, a month. Not a small amount for a manual laborer. But money came in and went right back out. He hardly kept anything for himself. According to bank transfer records police later extracted, combined with Li Ensheng's own statements, in the roughly 9 months from the wedding to the day of the crime, he had transferred over 150,000 yuan, approximately 21,000 US dollars, into Du Yue's account. And that was just the traceable transfers, not counting the cash he handed over directly. Where did all that money go? Li Ensheng never really knew. Whenever he asked, Du Yue would brush him off. Household expenses ate it up, or the shop needed working capital. True enough, Du Yue and her sister Du Jin had partnered to open the delivery station, and Li Ensheng himself had invested some money into it. The station was small, profits were slim, and cash flow pressure certainly existed. But for Li Ensheng, what frustrated him most wasn't paying out. It was that he couldn't see the bottom. Money kept pouring in like water, and he had no idea when it would ever be enough, when he'd finally stop having to hand over more. But something else choked him even harder: the rules Du Yue laid down. According to those police interviewed, Du Yue required her husband to hand over 8,000 yuan, approximately $1,100 every month for living expenses. If he couldn't come up with the full amount, he shouldn't bother coming home. Sounds simple on the surface, but for a manual laborer like Li Ensheng, that 8,000 was anything but easy. He had to earn the money first, and after deducting his own food, housing, transportation, and basic necessities at the worksite, he still needed enough left over to send home. Good months were manageable, slow months, or when he got sick. Where was that money supposed to come from? To cover the shortfalls, Li Ensheng started borrowing from online lenders. At first, just a few thousand, thinking he'd borrow briefly and pay it back. But thousands became tens of thousands, interest compounding on interest, snowballing larger and deeper. He didn't dare breathe a word to his elderly parents back home, let alone tell anyone else. Everything just quietly piled onto his shoulders, weighing heavier with each passing day. Li Ensheng began to change. He became more withdrawn, more brooding, his eyes always distant, as if lost in thought. He smoked more and more, cigarette after cigarette, one following the next. His coworkers could tell something was off, but whenever they asked, he'd just shake his head and say nothing. If money was the invisible hand slowly pushing a person against a wall, then trust was the wall itself, because what finally crushed Li Ensheng was the collapse of trust in this marriage. Before Chinese New Year 2023, after months of grueling work, Li Ensheng managed to save up a small sum. He thought, with the holiday approaching, he should go home and have a proper New Year for once. He decided not to tell anyone he was coming, partly to save on the cost of multiple trips back and forth, partly to surprise Du Yue when he suddenly showed up at the door. On the way home, he pulled out his phone and ordered some holiday treats: seafood, meat, and even an Australian lobster. He entered the new house's address for delivery. In his mind, he pictured the whole family gathered around the table, opening the boxes together, enjoying a warm New Year's meal. But when he got there, nothing was as he'd imagined. That afternoon, Li Ensheng stood at the door of the new house, pulled out his key, and inserted it into the lock. One turn, it wouldn't budge. Another turn, still stuck. He frowned, tried again, then suddenly realized the lock had been changed. He stood there for a few seconds, then raised his hand and knocked. Du Yue opened the door. From inside came the sound of lively chatter and laughter, the aroma of food wafting all the way out into the hallway. He stepped inside, looked up, and froze in place, as if someone had nailed his feet to the floor. In the living room, besides his mother-in-law and Bei Bei, there was another man sitting there, Du Yue's ex-husband. And on the dining table, a lavish spread was laid out. Right in the center sat a brilliant red Australian lobster, the very one he had ordered on his way home, meant for his family's reunion dinner. In that moment, Li Ensheng understood everything at once. The lock had been changed, decisively, without a word to him. And that New Year's feast on the table, it wasn't prepared for him. No one argued, no one raised their voice, but the air in the room suddenly froze, suffocating in its weight. His mother-in-law, Wang Shulan, spoke first. Her tone was ice cold, not a trace of surprise or welcome. "Why are you back?" Bei Bei sat at the table, glanced up at him briefly, then lowered her head and kept eating, not uttering a single greeting. The ex-husband just sat there, expressionless, as if Li Ensheng's presence had nothing to do with him. And Li Ensheng? He stood there, right at the threshold of the home he'd paid for, like a stranger who had accidentally walked into the wrong address. He didn't sit down for that meal. He turned, walked outside, found a quiet spot, and lit a cigarette. One after another, half a pack burned through before he even noticed. That night, instead of sleeping at home, he checked into a small motel nearby. The next day, Du Yue offered an explanation. She said her ex just came to visit their daughter, and since it was close to mealtime, he stayed to eat, nothing more. Li Ensheng listened without arguing, without asking follow-up questions. But a thorn had lodged itself in his heart that day, and from then on, it only drove deeper. After the holiday, Li Ensheng packed up and went back to work far from home, as usual. But this time, something was different. He started paying closer attention to what was happening at home. Every now and then, he'd call at odd hours, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning, as if checking to see what was going on. And a few times, he heard sounds on the other end of the line that he couldn't ignore. A man's voice. Once, Bebe answered. In the middle of their conversation, he clearly heard a man's voice in the background asking, "Who's that? Calling this late?" He asked Bebe who was there. The girl stammered, then finally just muttered, "No one." Details like that, in a normal family, probably wouldn't mean anything. Could have been a relative visiting, could have been a neighbor dropping by. But in a relationship already stretched taut as a wire, where trust had already cracked, every unexplained moment became suspicious, magnified many times over. By June 2023, Li Ensheng decided to go home and get some answers. He didn't announce his arrival ahead of time, and when he walked into the house, he started looking more carefully. According to what he later told police, he noticed signs of someone else living there. Men's toiletries that weren't his in the bathroom, clothes in the closet that weren't his size. The fight erupted right after. But Du Yue didn't offer any explanation he could believe. Instead, she turned the attack on him. "You're never home, you barely make any money, and the minute you come back, all you do is throw around accusations and start trouble." His mother-in-law, Wang Shulan, jumped into the argument, her words even harsher. Bebe stood by, watching silently, her eyes cold, touched with contempt. Not a single person in that house stood on his side. But the words that cut Li Ensheng deepest were the ones Du Yue hurled in the middle of the fight. "This house is in my mother's name. If you don't want to live here, then get out." That night, he went out again, checking into a small motel. Lying alone on that unfamiliar bed, he couldn't sleep. In his head, he started tallying up every cent he'd poured into this marriage, the 188,000 wen bride price, selling his old apartment for over 300,000, taking out a mortgage for the new place, the 70,000 for renovations, the monthly payments piling up month after month, not to mention the online loans with their compounding interest. The more he thought about it, the more terrifying it became. He calculated again and again. In total, he'd sunk nearly 700,000 wen, approximately 98,000 US dollars, into this. Almost everything he had. And now, at this moment, he couldn't even say for certain whether the house was his or not. The deed was in his mother-in-law's name. The money came from him. And here he was, being thrown out like a freeloader. In early July, Li Ensheng decided to go home one more time, the last time, to negotiate properly. He laid out two conditions. One, Du Yue had to cut off all contact with her ex-husband completely. Two, the family finances had to be transparent. Where money came from and where it went had to be clear. Du Yue's response was just 2 words: "Let's divorce." The divorce terms she laid out hit Li Ensheng like a bucket of ice water to the face. She made it plain. The house belonged to her family. The deed was clearly in Wang Shulan's name, nothing to discuss. As for the bank loans and online debts, those were Li Ensheng's. He borrowed them, he'd pay them back. The house had no share for him. The debts were all his. In other words, she wanted him to walk away with absolutely nothing. Never mind Li Ensheng. Anyone in that situation would find it impossible to swallow. The negotiation collapsed completely. Wang Shulan stood right beside her daughter, not saying a word in defense of her son-in-law. If anything, she backed her daughter up. And Bei, the child he'd thought he would treat as his own, stood there, looked him straight in the face and said, "This house doesn't welcome you." Li Yansheng left. He didn't know where else to go, so he went back to his parents' home in the countryside. From that day on, he became a different person. His father later told police he'd just sit there, not moving, smoking 4 or 5 packs a day. Ask him anything and he wouldn't answer. Push too hard and he'd only say one thing: "I'm suffocating inside." His mother cried until she had no tears left, murmuring the same thing over and over. "If I'd known it would come to this, I never should have pushed him to remarry." Li Yansheng just sat there silent, staring into nothing. And inside his chest a flame of fury smoldered, growing stronger each day, harder to control. One day before the crime, there was a clue that police would later reference repeatedly. It came from a funeral supplies shop in Haicheng. On the morning of July 10th, the shop received a male customer. The owner later told police. The man was fairly tall, his complexion terrible, his expression dark and brooding. He walked in without a greeting, without small talk, and immediately asked for 3 sets of burial clothes. What struck the shopkeeper as odd was how he placed the order. Usually, people buying funeral clothes would specify the height and weight of the deceased to get the right size. But this man didn't. He only gave ages. 1 set for a child around 10, 1 for a woman in her 30s, 1 for an elderly person over 60. Someone in that line of work has seen all kinds of customers, witnessed all kinds of grief. People who've genuinely just lost a loved one tend to be very specific, sometimes breaking down in tears right at the counter. Ordering by vague age range like this was extremely rare. Still, the shopkeeper didn't think much of it. Business is business. The items were prepared, payment collected, and the man took his bag and left. The whole process was quick. He barely said another word. It wasn't until July 11th, when the crime was discovered and police confirmed the identities of the 3 victims on the 2nd floor: a woman over 60, a 37-year-old woman, and a 13-year-old girl, that the shopkeeper's account suddenly took on a chilling edge. 3 sets of clothes, 3 ages, a perfect match. This detail pointed to a terrifying truth. This was no impulsive act born of sudden rage. The killer had thought it through, had planned it, had even prepared burial clothes for each victim in advance. For investigators, this kind of premeditation is a serious red flag. It meant that night wasn't simply a case of emotions boiling over. The evening of the crime, Yansheng had dinner at his parents' house. Someone remembered his state seemed off, even quieter than usual, barely touching his chopsticks. When family asked where he was going, he mumbled something like, "Got something to take care of outside. Might not be back." Later, during interrogation, Li Yansheng stated clearly, he had a key to the delivery station. It was a copy he'd secretly made beforehand, without Du Yue's knowledge. That night, he used that key to open the security door and quietly stepped into the 1st floor. He didn't linger downstairs, but went straight up to the 2nd floor, a path he'd walked countless times before. His footsteps were soft, barely making a sound. The door to the small room upstairs was unlocked. He pushed gently, and it swung open. Inside, all 3 were sound asleep. Wang Shulan lay on the small bed near the door. Du Yue and Bei shared the larger bed further inside. The window curtains weren't fully drawn. Moonlight seeped through the gap, casting a faint glow into the room, just enough to make out the outlines of everything. Li Yansheng stopped at the threshold. He didn't step in right away. He stood there for several minutes, silent. In that moment, images from the past suddenly flooded his mind. The first time they met, Du Yue smiling warmly as she greeted him, Bei obediently calling him uncle, Wang Shulan nodding approvingly. This young man looks honest. but those pleasant memories flickered by in an instant before being crushed beneath other images. Du Yue, stone-faced, demanding money. Wang Shulan dismissing him as useless, incapable of earning a living. Bei Bei deliberately pouring stinky tofu juice on his pillow. And that New Year's Eve, these three women gathered around the table with the ex-husband, laughing and chatting, while he stood at the door like a stranger who'd walked into the wrong house. All those memories swirled through his mind, piling on top of each other, choking with no release. The resentment that had built up over all those months suddenly surged to its peak, and then he pulled out the knife hidden on his person. The first to wake was Wang Shulan. Perhaps it was an old person's instinct, or maybe some small noise had pulled her from sleep. She opened her eyes, not yet comprehending what was happening, only seeing a dark figure looming beside her bed. Before she could cry out, before she could call for anyone, the violence had already begun. The noise from the small bed jolted Du Yue awake. She bolted upright, eyes not yet adjusted to the darkness, but she recognized immediately who was standing in the room. Li Ensheng. In an instant, her face changed, first horror, then fear, then fury. She screamed, "What are you doing? Get out!" But Li Ensheng didn't answer, not a word. He walked straight toward the larger bed. Du Yue instinctively lunged to shield Bei Bei, but the room was too small. Everything happened too fast. She had almost no room to maneuver, no time to react. Bei Bei woke amid the screaming and chaos. She cried out, and in her terror she blurted out one word, "Dad, don't!" That cry made Li Ensheng stop, clearly stop, for about 2 seconds. 9 months living under the same roof, and Bei Bei had never once called him Dad. This was the first time, and also the last. But that night, everything had already gone too far. There was no turning back. The tragedy continued, and ended in silence. The entire ordeal lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, the room fell into a deathly stillness. Li Ensheng stood there amid the cramped, disheveled space, the knife already dropped to the floor. He looked down at his hands, then slowly wiped away the red stains clinging to his skin. Then he did something that many people later couldn't understand. He took out the 3 sets of burial clothes he'd prepared the day before, 3 sets, 3 sizes, and dressed each of the victims in turn. When asked about this during interrogation, Li Ensheng said only one thing: "I wanted them to go with some dignity." When he finished, he left the delivery station, got in his car, and drove straight back to his parents' home in the countryside. That night, 3 lives came to an abrupt end. The small room on the second floor became the scene of a tragedy, and time, as always, kept moving forward, cold and indifferent. As mentioned earlier, on the very day of the crime, police quickly identified the suspect through surveillance footage. That afternoon, the Haicheng Police Department's wanted notice with a 50,000 yuan reward spread across social media. But in truth, Li Ensheng hadn't fled far at all. He went back to his parents' rural home and stayed there for 2 days. During those 2 days, he barely stepped outside. He just sat in one spot, staring blankly into space, not speaking a word, as if waiting for a conclusion he'd known was coming all along. His parents, a pair of honest, simple farmers, felt their entire world collapse when they learned what their son had done. His mother fainted from crying multiple times. His father's hair turned white overnight. The house held nothing but muffled weeping. On July 13th, Ensheng finally spoke to his parents. He urged them to call the police, and his reasoning was heartbreakingly pragmatic. If they captured him, he said, the family could at least collect the 50,000 yuan reward. Life would be a little easier for them. His father refused, hands trembling, saying he wanted to take his son to surrender. Maybe there'd be some leniency. Ensheng listened, then let out a bitter laugh. He said 3 lives were on the table. The outcome wouldn't change. That 50,000 yuan would be more useful to the family. In the end, his father, with trembling hands, dialed 110. When police arrived, Ensheng was already dressed in clean clothes, waiting quietly. He didn't resist. He calmly held out his hands for the cuffs. His mother rushed forward and clung to him, her sobs tearing through the air. Ensheng remained strangely calm, even whispering to comfort her. "Don't cry anymore, Mom. What I did, I'll take responsibility for." During interrogation, Li Ensheng admitted to all the facts of the crime without denial or evasion. But when asked about his motive, he maintained the same narrative from start to finish. Long-term financial exploitation, emotional betrayal and humiliation, dignity stripped away piece by piece with every passing day, and finally, the threat of divorce with nothing to show for it, which pushed him into total despair. He told the investigators, "It wasn't about money. It was about one breath. In that house, not a single day was I treated like a human being." In December 2023, the Anshan Intermediate People's Court issued its first instance verdict. Li Ensheng was guilty of intentional homicide, sentenced to death, with permanent deprivation of political rights. He appealed immediately in court. In April 2024, the Liaoning Provincial High People's Court reviewed the appeal and issued its ruling. Appeal rejected. Original sentence upheld. Outside the courtroom, when the verdict was announced, Li Ensheng's mother collapsed to the ground, unconscious. When she came to, she couldn't say anything else, just kept repeating the same words like a broken recording. "I shouldn't have pushed him to get married. I shouldn't have pushed." On November 30th, 2024, the Supreme People's Court approved the death sentence. On April 17th, 2025, at the Anshan execution grounds, he ate his final meal, dumplings his mother had made. In those last moments of farewell, his mother had cried herself silent, only gripping his hand tightly. His father, tears streaming, choked out, "In your next life, be born into a good family." Ensheng knelt and bowed deeply to his parents 3 times. On the execution grounds, a gunshot rang out. The case officially came to a close. This case drew national attention, not just because of the shock of 3 family members killed above a delivery station, but because it laid bare realities many people prefer not to examine too closely. The challenges of blending remarried families, the crushing pressure of bride prices and debt, the resentment over whose name is on a property deed, the tug of war when parents are too involved, the distance created when spouses work far apart for years, the devastation when trust collapses, the bitter fight over assets in divorce. These words sound cold, but behind every one of them are real people living real lives. And precisely because it all hits so close to home, the public debate has been especially fierce. And that concludes today's case. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.